now to talk through what this means for the state and more on impacts from the budget proposal. State Treasurer Erick Russell and State Comptroller Scanlon, thank you both so much for being here.
Good morning.
So we have obviously two of the big money managers for the state here with us right now. So I want to start off with, kind of the question we always start off with. How are the state of Connecticut's finances looking right now? Erick, I'll start with you.
Sure. So the state's finances are doing incredibly well. We are in a very different place than we were just 5 or 6 years ago. If you look at our real commitment to fiscal responsibility, balanced budgets, record surpluses, we've paid over $8.5 billion of unfunded pension liability down. We have a full rainy day fund at over $4 billion. And so the state is really doing well. We need to maintain this commitment in the work that we're doing, but I think it's really been important that we've shown our ability to balance this concern around fiscal responsibility, around addressing some of our longstanding fiscal issues, at the same time making sure we're investing directly in people and in the long-term future of our state.
And John, anything else you wanted to add in? I feel like Erick kind of summed it up really well there.
He did, and he's good at that. But we work together, obviously, and I agree with what Erick said. I would just say that if the last 10 years were about getting out of a fiscal crisis, the next 10 years are about figuring out if we can continue making the progress that we have been making while also addressing the new crisis, which is the affordability crisis. People across our state are having trouble dealing with healthcare, childcare, housing, energy. All these things are things that the governor talked about in his speech, that the legislature is working on in committees right now, and that we're focused on working with them to see how we can maintain that really good balance of meeting the needs of today without forgetting the problems that we still have as a result of decades of helping with the issues that are now, unfortunately, under control, but still very much there.
And like you said, an affordability crisis. A lot of people tell us, they hear that the rainy day fund is getting higher. They, see that the state has really good finances. However, they might wonder why they can't see more money put into programs, why prices are still so high. We heard in the governor's proposal this week, and we've heard from state lawmakers, for the past few sessions about possibly flexing those fiscal guardrails to use more of what the state has. Lamont didn't take a really clear stance on it in this budget address, but he did want to touch the surplus, calling for possible changes to the volatility cap. Where do you both stand on, possibly rethinking those fiscal guardrails?
So I think we should remain committed to the fiscal guardrails that we have in place, and we have bond covenants in place that, as a state, we need to make sure that we meet our obligations on. That being said, I think what the governor's proposal does is actually talks about making some of the adjustments, some of the tweaks to the guardrails that are allowable within the guardrails, right? And so it's those abilities to create some of this opportunity to free up some of the resources that right now would be flowing through kind of our normal waterfall to pay down pension debt. Right. But to also, and we're still going to be doing that under his budget proposal, to the tune of several $1 billion over the next few years, but also to free up some of that money now so that we can invest in some of the needs of people to really bring costs down. And I think his budget does a great job of balancing many of the needs that were touched on in terms of affordability, things like housing, things like bringing down the cost of prescription drugs, at the same time using some of those resources to make these longer term investments like a really critical and important need in early child care.
And Sean, you've been in lawmakers' seats before, and you've been there since before these fiscal guardrails were put into place. What do you want legislators to keep in mind now, as they go about thinking about possibly flexing this? And how do they answer to those constituents who are saying, why can't we have a bigger piece of the pie?
Yeah, well, I always used to say that the governor's budget proposal is the first inning of a 9-inning baseball game, right? And so now the Appropriations and Finance Committee that I used to chair will hold hearings about his proposal. They will present their own budget, and then there ultimately will be a discussion towards the end of session where the Speaker and the Senate President and a bunch of different people have their voices heard. And so what I would say to people is if everything you wanted was not in the governor's proposal, that's because this is a long process. Right. But I do think, to the governor's credit, he did put a lot of things in there that I think were important to a lot of people that we've been hearing about for the last few months. and that are a result, as I said a minute ago and as Erick just said, of seeing and hearing from the people of Connecticut about what they think the government should be working on. We can't control what happens in Washington. We can control what happens in Connecticut. And this was very much a proposal that reflects where I think the people of Connecticut want us to go. They like the progress we're making, and we are going to continue making it. But they also want us to see us addressing those direct challenges. And I think the balance that the governor struck yesterday is a really good start to a conversation I know many people want us to have and that we will be having.
And one of those pots that I think a lot of people are concerned about, childcare. Erick, the governor, took a big swing on suggesting $300 million of the surplus go to the future of potentially having universal pre-K here in the state of Connecticut. Obviously, that was just an investment. You know, those funds wouldn't immediately see that. We wouldn't see that, you know, pop up next year. But that could be some real change in childcare and education. Can you tell us a little bit more about, you know, how that might work if that were to get all the way into the final budget?
Sure, and as was mentioned by Sean, right, this is an early start to the process. I think what the governor's proposal does, though, is makes early child care a priority in our state. I think its budget itself reflects investment directly in early child care within the kind of general fund expenditures of the budget. But I think this is a really interesting way of using some of these dollars that would be that are surplus right now and making this long-term investment that it would essentially create spin-off from this endowment that we could then use to fund universal pre-K. Right. I think what's most important is, as we are talking about some of these issues, as we're thinking about the future in our state, these are the types of investments that need to be made. And it's not just because it's the right thing to do, which it is. It's because it makes really strong economic sense, right, as we think about the future. We know that every dollar that we put into early child care is returned 6 times over. We know that from an economic perspective, we want particularly our young families to be back out in the workplace. And so many families in our state are struggling right now with the decision of whether or not it makes sense to stay home from work or to go and get a job. But the cost of early child care is so weighs so much on folks that sometimes they're better off just staying home and taking care of their own child. We need to make, you know, as in terms of an economic investment, we need to really think about how we are prioritizing these issues in the future. And I think this was a really interesting way of approaching that.
Yeah. And, you know, speaking about a budget for the people and by the people, we know, Sean, you've been working to try and reflect the hospital industry and patients' needs with your healthcare cabinet conversations. You've put forward proposals and, you know, those policy conversations are already happening. But frankly, people were really frustrated this week by the governor not proposing nearly enough to deal with those Medicaid reimbursements. We heard from the Hospital Association and from, you know, patient advocates. They didn't feel like that was enough money. I know the state is trying to work on that formula, but is that, you know, enough of a funding boost for them? And what more do you think would need to be done this session?
Well, I think we have to go back and just step back and look at the real problem, right? In the last 10 years, premiums for the average person in Connecticut have risen by 40%, deductibles by 90%. This is an unsustainable crisis for the people of Connecticut, whether you get your insurance from the state or you get your insurance through your company or you try hard to buy it as an individual. It's expensive and hard in all those areas. And what we need to do is try to find ways to drive down the cost of healthcare, which is what the governor has asked me to do, given that I run the largest employer-based health plan in the state. We are working with people like the hospitals and advocacy groups and doctors to try to find that common ground. And one of the things that the governor put in his budget is for us to apply for a federal waiver from the Trump administration that will allow us to utilize some federal dollars to do the kind of increases that we do need to make for the Medicaid program. This is good for everybody because the more money we spend to make Medicaid better, the more costs go down for everybody, and that helps everybody in our state. And so it's complicated, it's wonky, it's difficult. We have to get the federal government to agree to do what we want to do, but we're on the path to do that. I'm really proud to be convening some of these conversations, and at the end of the day, what I want the people of Connecticut to know is that we hear you. We know that you're fed up with the high cost of health care, and we are doing something about it, and I hope that we can do that on a bipartisan basis here in Connecticut.
And we know those conversations are going to continue, of course, this session. You mentioned asking for some of that federal funding. We know that was a big topic and mentioned quite a bit by the governor in his proposal this week. There's been a lot of chaos and confusion and really uncertainty from the new White House in these first few weeks. We're talking about possible federal funding freezes. That right now is kind of in limbo. But we know there's a lot of confusion in general and conversation about just kind of overall slashing congressional spending. What are both of your offices planning for, preparing for, if you can even prepare for, and what are some of those fears or concerns right now?
Well, look, my office is in charge of tracking what we take in and spend on the federal level. And in fiscal year 2024, we got $14.3 billion of federal money. That doesn't mean that we got it and budgeted for it. It means that it passed through the state, either to state agencies or to local providers or to local police departments or school districts. This is vital money that literally makes a difference in the life of every single person in our state. And so when the president made that decision to pause it, it scared a lot of people. And Erick and I's phones were ringing all day from people just asking questions. By the day or the day after, he had decided to not pause that. But make no mistake, if that pause comes back, it will impact negatively, in my opinion, every single person in our state. And that's police departments, that's hospitals, that's schools, that's veterans, that's everybody. I understand looking for efficiencies and finding waste, fraud, and abuse. We're both totally on board with that. How you do it, though, is a really important thing. And by doing a blanket pause and scaring a lot of people is not the way to go about it. We are always looking for efficiencies, and we have found some. We're happy to work with the administration to do that. But scaring people, that's not the way to go.
And, Erick, for you, what could this mean in terms of the state maybe having to make up some of that revenue if we don't see that federal funding or it gets paused again in the future?
Certainly. I would start with, I think the fiscal position that we're in as a state is really important right now. And I think if you take a step back, the reserves that we have, the sound budgeting practices that we've really taken on as a state put us in a position that we can withstand some of this volatility, right? We have reserves. Yeah. That being said, and as Sean mentioned, the amount of funds that we have coming from the federal government far outweigh kind of what we are normally producing and what we are budgeting off of. And so we wouldn't be able to kind of fill all of those holes over some extended period of time. Right. I think big picture, I think the chaos as what was mentioned is really, that's the challenging piece, right? We think about it, one, just from predictability and what folks expect in our state, and then certainly from my office on the investment side, thinking about broader fiscal policy. So much of what's rolling out from the administration right now is creating a lot of uncertainty. We know that many of the policies, we don't know what's actually going to move forward or what isn't, but we know that many of those policies are inflationary, right? And so in addition to just the withholding of funds coming in, we have to make sure that we're able to kind of withstand whatever volatility we may see in the market. There's been tariffs that have obviously been proposed that would have really inflationary impacts for us in Connecticut, but across the country. A lot of the policies around deportation, both legal and undocumented immigrants, would certainly be inflationary. And then what's proposed around much of the tax cuts that would be coming and potentially ballooning deficits for the country, which could also have inflationary impacts. We're tracking all of this, and certainly on the investment side, we're making sure that we have the flexibility to continue to do work that's going to provide for beneficiaries in our state and navigate some of that volatility that may be presented.
Yeah, and as we've said, throughout these conversations are going to continue. You've both mentioned that this is just a starting point. Really quickly in our last minute here, what do you want constituents and residents in the state to know about keeping track of this budget session? We hear all the time from state lawmakers that hearing from their constituents can really impact how they vote on things. And obviously, as people, as you've mentioned, are concerned about the chaos on Capitol Hill, what do you want them to know about this session? Why is it important for them to keep track of what's happening?
The best thing I ever got as a state rep was feedback from my constituents, whether I was at the grocery store, at dinner with my wife, or they came to my office hours. Always err on the side of talking to your representatives, and even to Erick and I. Erick and I are the youngest people to ever have these jobs. We are very accessible in what we do, and we want to hear from people about where they want to see the state going, because God willing, we're going to be around for a while, not necessarily always in these jobs, but we care about Connecticut. We want Connecticut to be the best it can be for my kids and our kids' generations, and everything we can do to help people. But that starts with hearing from you as well, and don't ever be afraid to do it.
And I would just say the same thing. The participation in this process is so important, right? And so we will have a host of hearings around bills, around the budget. As was mentioned, the legislature will be putting forth a budget. Please reach out to your legislators, reach out to elected officials, let your voice be heard, let folks know what issues are important to you. That's ultimately what's going to guide where our state goes moving forward. And so we always welcome that. We look forward to that feedback so that we can be a part of implementing it.
Absolutely. Erick, Sean, thank you both so much for taking a couple minutes to check in with us.
Good to be here.
As political news and attempted policy changes continue at this rate, we want to remind you to pace yourself, but of course stay informed and stay engaged. The number on your screen connects you to your congressional representation, so you can tell them what matters to you. And you can always find all of our coverage of all things local and national impacts here on air, online, and on the Fox 61 News app. That's all we have time for on The Real Story this week. Have a great rest of your morning.